Now, let's take a deep dive into the Atlassian's data center solutions. And for that, please welcome Sunny from our US team. Over to you, Sunny.
Hey everyone, this is Sunny. Just so you know, I sort of work on the pre-sales team and we'll be heading up the webinar today. Thank you, Anthony, for sort of the handoff there, as well as the introduction. So, as Anthony said, we'll be talking a bit about data center today in terms of what are some key indicators, as well as just some general use cases for people that have gone to data center. Just to go quickly over the agenda, we'll be talking about some of the deployment options that exist today in the Atlassian space. And of course, then we'll sort of dive into some of the key indicators that we've talked about. And then we'll review a couple of use cases for people that have moved to data center and some of the underlying factors that really push them in that direction. And then finally, or I shouldn't say finally, but we'll talk a bit about scaling with Valiantys and how we can sort of help you really see these indicators, number one, and number two, solve some of those problems that may be indicators themselves, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. Now, in terms of deployment options that are available in the Atlassian space, you of course have the server version of Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, etc. There are a few of the Atlassian tools that offer the server option. Now, this server option is essentially one node or one server that is hosting your application. This is quite common, I think, for many of the attendees here, I'm sure, and the general distribution of the Atlassian ecosystem. Typically is suitable for 1,000 users. Of course, there are server instances that go quite a bit over this that may or may not experience some performance issues, but typically I'd say the server application is they start running to some of these issues really as they approach that 1,000 user mark and go over. They of course have control over upgrades, and it's on the end user that is hosting the server to manage those upgrades. And it is fully customizable, meaning you have full control over your infrastructure and the ability, again, to do upgrades and maintenance on your own. The general layout, of course, is that the application itself, Jira, which is on a server, is pointed to a database. Again, that's on its either own server or up in AWS, and then a file system, of course, that houses many of the artifacts of the actual application. And then, of course, you have your network that's accessing the application at any point in time. This is pretty common, I would say. Now, data center, of course, is what we're sort of showcasing here in the sense that its architecture is multiple nodes. So if server is just one Jira server or a Confluence server, data center is multiple sets of those servers. So you essentially have, let's just talk about Jira for that matter. You have 3 Jira servers, 4 Jira servers, etc., that are balancing the load of incoming requests. So if your company is hosting Jira, you now have X amount of Jira servers to balance the load that you may be having from your customers. Again, it is self-hosted. So again, you are responsible for the infrastructure. One plug that I'll throw in here is that, of course, Valiantys offers hosting as well, both for server and data center applications. So if infrastructure is not something you're looking to manage or looking to get away from, we understand that there are heavy pain points there. And so there are hosting options available for you through us. But typically it is, again, self-hosted, meaning that someone needs to be responsible for the infrastructure. There is, of course, high availability and performance at scale. That is the benefit of having this architecture. Now, high availability in the sense that you have multiple servers now, so that in the event that one server goes down, that is not a single point of failure anymore, so that you have other servers to take in the requests and keep your Jira or Confluence up and running. So that high availability is very crucial to a lot of enterprise customers, and really any customers that value the Atlassian toolset quite heavily. And then performance at scale. So we talked about, imagine in your server instance, you only have one server that's handling all of your requests. Naturally, as you scale that out and have multiple servers in data center, you are able to distribute the load that you are getting across those servers, and inherently improving the performance that you will get as you grow. So the more requests come in, the more distribution that you have, and of course, the load on the system is therefore less, allowing for better performance. You of course have that flexibility of deployment as well. You can host it internally. You have the ability, of course, to host it in your cloud provider, whether it be AWS or Azure. And as well as with us, we typically use AWS for our hosting. And then just to go over the architecture again, you have a shared database that is managing the actual storage and data model for the application across all of your nodes, and then a shared file system that's of course handling all of the artifacts for all of your nodes. Those three nodes are being, in terms of distribution of load, that's being handled by a load balancer that is essentially taking in all of your requests and then determining which node to send the request to based on certain parameters. So the data center can be configured, of course, to handle that load in various ways. Certain customers like to leave a node dedicated for specific types of requests, whereas general user requests will go to the rest of the nodes. Whereas other customers don't necessarily care or have a bias as to how the load distribution is handled, whereas the default application will handle it in a sort of round robin, even distribution manner. And then we'll talk about some key indicators for, of course, data center. So typically you have customers that will run into hardware limits. It's no surprise that as you grow, you're going to hit some limits, and the rate at which you grow will really determine the limits that you reach or hit. So as people hit sort of storage limits, performance limits, and of course, whether it be database or server application limits, there are going to be hardware limits that you approach. Those limits are really going to determine your next steps in terms of your infrastructure. High availability as well is quite key. You can imagine that if you are on Jira Server and your server goes down, that is downtime for you. And whether that be a minute, 10 minutes, an hour, high availability is one of the largest indicators for customers, especially if Jira or Confluence are mission critical to their business. Upgrades without interrupting your service. Now, this is also another key benefit, as you can imagine, if you are on server. If you need to do an upgrade, you typically need to go down and do the upgrade. Now that certain teams or customers have gotten their upgrade process down to a pretty quick turnaround, but again, for customers that are 24/7, that have global distribution, can't afford to be down for even a minute. So with data center, you are getting the huge benefit of being able to upgrade your application without going down even for a second. So that's a huge benefit there. Concurrent users as well. So we have customers that are on server that may have 2,000, even 3,000 users that say that they don't necessarily think they would need data center. They've been handling their application fine, but it's not about the amount of users that have access. It's about the concurrent users that really can show an indicating factor that you need data center. So if you have 3,000 users that are not necessarily using it at the same time, you may not run into performance issues, but as you can imagine, if you are having stand-up meetings, or if you are having, let's just say Monday, where you have all of your typical meetings to plan out your work, you may have a higher load, and at those times you may see some performance decrease or even outages. So it's important to look at not just your total user count in terms of license, but of course, how many users are using the system at one time, and how is that impacting your system. And then, of course, in terms of data, now data is, of course, another piece that's a bit overlooked. People just typically will look at the users, but it's important to think that as your data is growing, as your data is becoming more complex, whether it be with apps or integrations, that volume of data will also impact your performance. So as your data is scaling out, whether you hit 1 million issues, 2 million issues, things like that, there are certain indicators from a data perspective that will qualify you to move to data center. And then performance as well. You may have a server instance that is relatively small, 500 users, 1,000 users, but maybe your volume of data is quite high and you're having performance issues at certain times, right? So again, as you grow, certain apps that are not optimized may impact your performance. And again, data center will help distribute some of that load to really give you the most optimal performance in your systems. Now, some criteria to consider again, users, we typically look at, I think the basic qualification for data center would be 500 users, but of course, server can handle typically well up to 1,000, but anything above that you want to consider data center. Performance, this is quite obvious and self-explanatory. If you are experiencing at certain times getting those requests from your end users, I think we've all been there, that they're complaining about performance. Jira is very slow, Confluence is slow. So performance is another key piece. Downtime, I always like to equate any downtime that you have as a company. How much money does that cost you for every minute that your Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket are down, right? That is time that your end users are not working. Those end users are, of course, being paid some sort of salary to do some work. Now, I would encourage everyone to do an exercise internally to determine what every minute of downtime in your company costs from a Atlassian perspective. And that exercise may really help quantify for you or justify upgrading to Jira Data Center or the Atlassian Data Center suite. Administration as well, as you try to make your server instance scalable and have good performance, that's more administration overhead. So think about your system admins that are working double time, overtime, triple time, whatever they need to do to try and make your server application run optimal. Now, of course, if they have data center, it will free up some of their time and give them less grievance over time as well. And for other sort of key indicators, we've actually published with Atlassian a data center white paper, which is quite popular. And it, in fact, goes over some use cases for data center. We've looked at some customers that have over 10 million issues and how that performance scales. And we have some nice charts and statistics on response times and whatnot that really, I think, will give you some indication as to what the server application would handle versus what the data center application would handle. And then in terms of use cases, so we have a couple of use cases here that we just wanted to generally go over for some of our customers and Atlassian's customers. So of course, we can think about banking and how certain customers have very large teams. So we actually introduced Atlassian tools, and for that matter, to one of our customers in Jira, Confluence, and Bitbucket in 2012. And that's actually not that long ago, but you can imagine that's assuming that they've invested in sort of are using this tool in the right way, they're going to grow. And in fact, they grew from 100 users to 20,000 users in that time to now. That's about an average annual growth of 43%. Now, don't quote my math on that. I don't know the exact percentage. That's just what I was given. But you can imagine that's a lot of growth every single year. And that poses some challenges, right? So from a challenges perspective, performance and scalability are, of course, key. Now, if you're on a single server as you're growing, you have these performance issues that are coming up day in and day out, and you're not necessarily scalable, right? As it's growing, you have no sort of concrete plan to solve some of these growth issues. And as you're doing upgrades, that's downtime, right? So as you're growing, and you can imagine at 10,000 users or 15,000 users, whatever the case may be, that's a lot of users, and that's a lot of usage of the tools. And any downtime will seriously hinder some of your metrics and of course performance as a company. And then of course their solution was of course data center, and getting data center installed and up and running was one of our largest sort of benefits of this. And we're here to help you to move from server to data center and assist you in that transition. And so data center is of course a big conversation in the sense that there is migration that needs to happen from an infrastructure perspective, as well as building the architecture that will scale and that supports the installation as well. So, and then another use case actually that we had for another telecom leader was that they of course actually introduced the Atlassian toolset pretty recently in 2016. So even more recent than, of course, the banking customer. They have quite a large set of customers globally, or I should say employees globally, but roughly they had about 6,000 users sort of already distributed across Jira, Jira Service Desk, Confluence, and whatnot. They, of course, had growth, but they had growth that was very distributed. So 60 instances at one point of Jira globally. Now you can imagine that's a lot of Jira instances, and that distribution, of course, doesn't necessarily give everyone the optimal performance, nor does it give everyone an optimal set of insight, right? Now, if you want to do reporting across your company as a whole, it's kind of tough to do with 60 different Jira instances. They actually had an annual growth of 70%, which is that's very rapid growth. Now, of course, the challenges that come from that are the availability, right? Now, if we're talking about a global company that has customers that are distributed across the world, any server that goes down, that's going to be an issue for anyone that's using the system. And of course, performance, right? Certain instances may have very high load, certain instances may have very minimal load. Now, again, that's optimization that needs to happen globally. And it's also a lot of servers to maintain. You can imagine the infrastructure teams that are there for this company. That's a lot of management for them, and they're not necessarily operating in the most optimal fashion. And then, of course, so the solutions there really were to introduce data center in specific regions and to consolidate those 60 instances of Jira to get them sort of in a more uniform global fashion. Now, of course, these upgrades and whatnot that still need to happen. Now, the benefit of data center, of course, is that you don't need to go down to do upgrades. But of course, upgrades themselves do introduce change as well. So they actually opted for enterprise releases as well, so that they could find themselves on a more standard cadence to upgrade their infrastructure. And they introduced this sort of cadence globally, so that their infrastructure teams, again, could perform in a more optimal fashion with the right planning. So this customer really benefited from that sort of offering, and their growth will scale accordingly. Now, in terms of scaling with Valiantys, so how can we help you go about this journey? So, of course, we offer audits and sort of scoping sessions where we can review your current installation, whether that be server or you may already be on data center, right? Maybe you need help sort of aligning your data center and getting it configured correctly. Are we sort of set up in the right fashion? Document your current processes. Again, we talked about infrastructure teams, their upgrades, and how that can be quite a bit of burden on them to manage. So managing all of that, we can help you document your current processes. We can, of course, give you advice on your architecture setup and evaluate how it's currently configured to sort of understand, are you in the best practice of Atlassian, right? Are you setting up your infrastructure in a way that will support the tools? And of course, we can help you deploy data center. We have many customers that come to us with their server instances and say, hey, we want to be on data center. Here are the keys. Please handle it overnight, right? Whereas other customers will say, hey, listen, we have an infrastructure team. We want you to collaborate with them so that we can get onto data center ASAP. And that's really how much we have to say, I guess, really for server versus data center. Hopefully I've given some insight into some of the indicators that are there for moving from server to data center, as well as how you can go about moving from server to data center, whether you choose to use us or, of course, take that journey on your own. Either way, we're here to help.